So we've gone over pH and energy in general, and now let's shift gears and focus on energy within a living system. Energy within a living system primarily is going to be stored away or used in the form of ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. These are like rechargeable little batteries that we can use within our cells. ATP is a nucleotide, meaning it belongs to the nucleic acid category of the macromolecules, similar to what DNA and RNA are made of. When we break off a phosphate group from ATP, energy gets released. And when we need to recharge ATP, we do so using an enzyme called ATP synthase found in the mitochondria. So let's look at how we actually utilize ATP and ADP. It turns out that ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the name meaning that we have an adenine, which is our nitrogen-containing base, ribose, which is our sugar, and phosphate groups, 3 of them, giving the triphosphate in the name. These phosphate groups have these really high energy bonds held between them. And this is what makes this molecule very unstable, is that there's a lot of energy held between these bonds and the bonds want to break. So when this happens, when we break a phosphate group off, so one of those phosphate groups separates, we're releasing all of that energy held between those bonds in that ATP molecule. We can use that energy to power other chemical reactions happening inside the cell. When we break that phosphate group off, we're left with adenine, the ribose, and only 2 phosphates, giving us the name adenosine diphosphate. So when you're looking at something like in your book, you'll see that the symbol for ATP has this kind of starburst look around it to demonstrate the high energy held within the bonds of ATP. And when we see ADP, we see that that halo effect is gone to show that the energy has been expended. So ATP is this really high energy molecule. It doesn't hang around for very long, but it's very powerful. And we can break those phosphate groups off to power all the different chemical reactions that happen within inside of our bodies and inside of our cells. Now, the great thing is that this ATP molecule, we can kind of recharge it and recycle it in a way. So we can use the same ATP molecules over and over and over again by putting in some energy to put a phosphate group back on. So we get that energy when we break down the food that we eat. When we break down the food we eat, we can go through a process, which we'll get into in a little bit, to put a phosphate back onto ADP, forming ATP. Then that ATP can break off a phosphate to release that energy somewhere else in the body to help power some other chemical reaction somewhere else. It's a nice process in order for us to extract the energy from the food we consume, put it into a usable format, and then use that energy for reactions that otherwise would not happen if they didn't have this extra energy input. Let's look at one of the organelles that's very important for this process of producing this ATP, the mitochondrion. You may have heard of the mitochondrion on the internet as the powerhouse of the cell, and while that is somewhat accurate, it's not quite as deep as we want to go for this class. We're going to go a little bit deeper than that. First, let's look at the structure, because to understand what these mitochondria are doing, the structure is actually pretty important. So we have this bean-like shape, and we call this a bag within a bag because there's a membrane on the outside, and then there's also a second membrane on the inside. So the bean shape is the first membrane, and then we have this wavy kind of structure on the inside, and that's the second membrane. We call the space between the 2 membranes the intermembrane space, and the very, very inside of that second membrane, the mitochondrial matrix. There's a really important thing happening in this second membrane. There are actually channels that are pumping across from the intermembrane space to the mitochondrial matrix that are going to help produce ATP. We do that through what's called the electron transport chain, which is basically taking high energy electrons, moving them down a process to a lower energy level, using that to artificially pump hydrogen ions onto one side, and then as those hydrogen ions naturally diffuse across to the other side, using that movement to produce ATP, to rephosphate, basically rephosphorylate and add that phosphate back on to ATP. So we don't want to just say it's the powerhouse of the cell. While true, it's too generic for us. We want to talk about how we're using an electron transport chain to produce ATP in that inner membrane.